Hey, Trader Shane from GMT Futures and FX. I'm going to take you through our GMT Pivot Trader base trade sell entry. So it's basically our initial sell entry. Now, the indicators we're going to have loaded on the chart will be the MACD BB, the moving average envelopes. We'll have our paint bar, which will be cyan and white. We'll have our support resistance, our VM indicator, our chop filter, and our trend strength filter. So they're the indicators we're going to be using. Now the preconditions for the entry are that we need a pivot count of 2, and we're using a pivot high of 7 and a pivot low of 7. So I'm setting the pivots a little bit higher. Now I also want to have a minimum price move. I've got 30 here as an example. But we're going to go to the charts now. I'm going to show you what that actually means. So this is really just the basic trade setup, sell setup on the pivot trader. We're only looking for the very basic entry. So we're not going to use all the indicators that we have, but we're just looking at our basic sell entry. Alright, so we've got a chart up. So we have our chart up here of crude. We've got all our indicators loaded up. We have the cyan and white candles loaded on the chart to show the trend, obviously the direction of the trend and the trend. We've got our MACD Bollinger Band, our VM indicator, our trend strength indicator, and our chop indicator. Now, all we're doing at the moment is we're looking for our basic sell pivot entry. So the prerequisite is that we need basically a pivot high, which we have here, and we need a lower pivot high, which we have there. That's our prerequisite. The other thing we're looking for in this trade setup is we're looking for a minimum run up. Now I said I wanted 30 points on crude. Now at the moment between the pivot high and the pivot low, this is the lower pivot high is where you're looking for your potential entry. This is a sell entry, so we need a count of 7 from our pivot high, which is basically, and we'll just run through this now. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's your 7 candles, and that's going to set up your confirm your pivot high, which will print there. So that's a lower high from the previous one. So that means we've got a potential sell. So that's our weak pivot entry. Now, what we need though to get that trade on is we need to have a minimum distance between our previous pivot low and our previous pivot high, or our pivot high. So that minimum distance, and I'll just mark that up on the chart, that's really just to confirm that there's movement in this range. We don't really want to really take a tight pivot between a low and a high. We want a minimum distance there. Now you can select whatever it is and optimize on whatever distance you want. So if you go into the strategy now, format strategy, you'll see that the GMT pivot trader, we've got our pivot count, which is the number of pivots back we're counting. We've got our left strength and our right strength, which I mentioned was 7 and 7. We've picked our weak pivot. So our weak pivot is our lower pivot on a sell. We'll talk about the buy setup separately in another video, but our weak pivot is our lower pivot high on a sell, and we want a minimum distance. So the minimum price move we've set is 30. So let's put 30 in there. Now, as I said before, when you go through and do your testing, you might decide, well, I'm not sure what the minimum distance is I want, but I want it to be a reasonable distance. So I'm going to test to work out what the minimum distance is, or what's the most profitable minimum distance on this chart and this market that I'm trading. So you might set it at maybe perhaps 10 and 50, and then do it in increments of 5. And that'll run a strategy test for you to work out what is the optimal minimum distance for this trade setup. So we'll just close out of that, and we'll go OK. So that's all we're really looking for at the moment. We're looking for, all right, we need a minimum distance, and we've got 45 points, so we've cleared that requirement. We've got our sell set up now. As soon as we've had these lower price moves from that high, so we typically use these pivot points to identify areas of support and resistance. So obviously if we're using a pivot high, we're looking for an area of resistance, and we need to have 7 bars obviously before that are lower than that bar there, and then we have to have 7 bars past that high to print a pivot high. So basically what we've got here is we've got an area of resistance. So an area of resistance is an opportunity for us to sell. So the pivot trader is a great strategy because it's working off basic price action. So we do have indicators that are going to validate the entry, but we'll talk about those later. But the initial setup purely is based on an area of resistance. We're getting that pivot print, that pivot high print, and once we have that, then we're ready to sell. And you can see the short entry's taken. Price on that short entry there is 53.90. The other perfect part about that sell setup is that it's right near the key level. So if we add in our key level filters, so we'll insert one of our indicators, and we have the GMT key level indicator. So I'll let in that GMT key level, and that just gives you a nice little look at, right, well, we're trading the pivot trader, we're looking for a sell setup, we've got that pivot setting up right on the sell, and we've got our initial entry. Now, we're not using that key level as one of our filters, although we do have that built into our strategy. So if we go into our strategy, you'll see format strategy, and we actually do have that as part of our entry. So down here at the key level, so we can take trades before or after the entry. So that's our basic sell setup. So all we're looking for is a lower pivot high. We're looking for a minimum distance to be qualified, and we've said 30 points here. We've got 45 there, and we need that bar to print. Now, if I choose a 3 pivot high, then I'm only looking for 3 bars to print, and then that'll basically give me my sell entry. So the higher the pivot setting, the longer it's going to take you to get into trades. The lower the pivot setting, the more frequent trades you're going to get, and the faster you're going to get into trades. So that's just an example of that setup, and that's on a 505 tick bar. So very simply, the sell setup, that's the sell entry, and that's just our basic entry setup. Thanks for your time, traders. I look forward to catching you on the next training video update. Cheers.